Somewhere about 1862, one of the great spirituals was recorded. That is, the lyrics were written down by a man in Oklahoma. He said he heard a man and his daughter singing it. That man's name was Wallace Willis. It's actually very rare that we have one of the great Negro spirituals attributed to an actual author. There is still some dispute over that, but it doesn't matter. It was passed on and then passed on again, and especially during the Civil War, as ministers and teachers and Union officers were throughout the South, they began to hear and record the spirituals. Thomas Wentworth Higginson did it, the commander of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. He was astonished at the music he was hearing out of his own soldiers. By 1871, the Fisk Jubilee Singers at Fisk College, soon Fisk University, one of the colleges founded by the Freedmen's Bureau, was formed. And in 1872, the Fisk Jubilee Singers sang "Steal Away to Jesus" at the White House for President Grant. And a year later, they made their first European tour and sang it for Queen Victoria in London, where it's claimed that Queen Victoria sang along with them. Who cares? But if my phone works, "Steal Away" is often, if you look it up immediately people assume it was somehow an Underground Railroad song. Must have been. Steal away to Jesus, steal away, steal away. He ain't got long to stay here. Possibly it was a song reflecting the runaway fugitive slave experience. Whether that's actually true or not, we'll never know. But I've always heard it as a song of faith, too. Faith in the face of loss. Faith in the face of near hopelessness. It may be an escape song, for sure. But escape to something, from something, away from something. Now, Reconstruction is a rise and fall story. And today I want to, begin to make more sense of that. First of all, I'll be conducting a conversation tomorrow, another one of these book talks. This one, very special. Jonathan Schroeder discovered about 10 years ago now, I think it is, an extraordinary new slave narrative written by John Jacobs, who was the brother of Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs, of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, the most famous female slave narrative of all. Her brother, a bit older, was a close friend of Frederick Douglass's. There's a fair amount of correspondence. But John Jacobs went to sea. He escaped from America. He did not stay. He stole away. And most of the rest of his life he spent on the oceans. But he spent a fair amount of time in Australia. And he wrote in 2 installments his own version of a slave narrative for a Sydney, Australian newspaper in 1855. And Schroeder has had the incredible good luck of discovering the original and has just published this book. The title is John Jacobs' title of his slave narrative. The United States governed by 600,000 despots. Now there's a title. Gee, wonder what it means. It's a very unusual slave narrative, and we'll discuss that tomorrow afternoon, 4:30 in HQ, room 276, second floor. Check it out. I take a great interest in slave narratives, having worked on Douglass's, having discovered 2 other post-Civil War slave narratives. Were lopped in, well, I didn't discover them, they were lopped in my lap. These things rarely appear, but when they do, it's news. His book has had a great deal of news coverage and so forth, but I got him to come, and we'll have a discussion of the John Jacobs slave narrative and slave narratives generally, 4:30 tomorrow in HQ. Now, the 15th Amendment. What we're going to do today, if you didn't see the outline already, is discuss this idea of 2 revolutions. And we'll do the same on Thursday as we take Reconstruction out and set ourselves up for it can't happen here, or did it happen here, or has it happened here, or will it happen here? But Reconstruction is 2 revolutions. There's the revolution of emancipation and what flows from it, the transformation of the Constitution into 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and Reconstruction Acts and et cetera, roughly 1863 to 67. And then there's the counter-revolution, the revolution of the white South, the revolution of the old planter class, the revolution of white supremacy. All revolutions generally have counter-revolutions. That's there are very few, cycles in history you can hang your hat on. That's one. They always happen. And that second revolution was essentially from, well, even before 1874, actually, but especially by 74, as we'll see in a moment. With that election of 74, the Republican Party is crushed, thrown out. We know something about, pivotal elections that throw people in and out, whether we like it or not. Now, but the 15th Amendment was often considered sort of, the last possible great act of the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's the right to vote, the cornerstone of democracy. Let's jump ahead here. I just jotted down here, I'm sorry, this is in my printing, but it might be readable. The 15th Amendment actually had three forms it could have taken. They debated vigorously in 1868 into 69 three different versions of this great voting rights amendment. They ended up, of course, passing the most conservative one, the first one, where the asterisk is. Now, how did this come about? Well, first of all, there's context. Grant wins the election in 68 with the use of black voting based upon the Reconstruction Acts in the South, and without that black male vote in the South, he's not president. Republicans would have lost already. There is racist resistance even in the North, especially in the North, to voting rights for blacks. In 1868, only 11 of 21 northern states, 11 of 21 northern states still denied the vote to black citizens. They're citizens now, according to the 14th Amendment, but they can't vote. And that includes Connecticut, which passed the restriction on black voting as early as 1824. The Reconstruction Acts had imposed black suffrage on the South. Imposed it. Southerners didn't vote for that. The amendment was drafted between Grant's election in November 68 and his inauguration March of 69. Three versions, as you see right in front of you. The first would forbid states to deny suffrage on the grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's the one that's actually going to get into the language of the 15th. A second version they rigorously debated, and there were radical Republicans who desperately wanted this, would have forbid states to impose literacy tests, property tests, nativity qualifications tests of all kinds. And right away, obviously, you begin to realize that could have headed off, at least legally, all the machinations that will be practiced in the Jim Crow South from 1890 onward over the next 30, 40 years to prevent people from voting, including, counting the jelly beans in a jar. A third version would simply have said, as it says here, would simply affirm that all male citizens, this was the broadest of all male citizens, 21 years or older, have the right to vote. Period. That's what the radicals wanted. But they're not really quite running the show anymore. Not with Grant's election. That third version would have been a tremendous enlargement of federal power. Some, even Republicans, weren't willing to go there. They're afraid of federal power. They still believe in federalism and keeping as many powers as possible in the states. And look around you today. Who controls voting? Every state, every county. We have totally localized voting in this country, unlike many, many other modern democracies. There was much, much debate, tugging, toing, and froing, and fighting over which version of this would pass, but the only one they could get passed was the first. There were great celebrations of this. This was putting the right to vote at least on some level, even with its tenuous, controls, if any. There was something truly amazing to lots of people. They had just put the right to vote for black men in the Constitution. Yes, there will be a rigorous debate between women suffragists and the advocates of the right to vote for black men. And a terrible falling out in time between the likes of Frederick Douglass and plenty of others and the leaders of the women's suffrage movement, namely Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and others. The common phrase at this point was, "It's the black man's hour." It was. But women rightfully said, we put off our cause to win that Civil War, to bring about black freedom. We worked, our shoes off and more to bring about emancipation. We want the vote. And women, of course, are not in the 15th Amendment. Now, anyone with one eye open understood that if you put women into the 15th, it never passes. There would have been no 15th Amendment. We don't have to like that. But that's the reality. And Douglass was all for women's suffrage. He was all for, he's not alone here, by the way, all for inclusion of women. He said so over and over and over in the 15th Amendment. It didn't happen. That'll have tremendous repercussions down the rest of the 19th century in terms of the relationship of former abolitionists with the women's suffrage movement. And women, of course, are going to wait another 40-some years, more than that, for the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. It passed Congress on the 26th of February, 1869. The necessary 2/3 of the state legislatures, which are just on the verge of coming back into the Confederate states, are just on the verge of coming back into the Union under the Reconstruction plan, but not quite yet. The 2/3 of the state legislatures was achieved on March 30, 1870. Douglass, among others, didn't like the 15th Amendment at all. He wanted the most encompassing, the most protective. Douglass constantly called the right to vote the ring of fire. That was his favorite metaphor for it. He called it the ring of fire around all other rights. If you have the right to vote, you can protect all other rights. It's the ring of fire. Is it? Over time, debatable. But across the country, in the North in particular, the weariness now with all these issues of Reconstruction, weariness with the issues of the South, thus Southern problem, now had an easy place to go rest. And that was in this idea of guaranteed rights. What was left to do now? Well, slavery was abolished in the 13th. The 14th Amendment in its various parts created birthright citizenship, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and equality before law. A revolution in law, in world history. And now you got the 15th. Yeah, it's limited, but look, what a start. And all over the Northern press, good Republicans were saying things like the New York Tribune did. Quote, "Let us have done with Reconstruction. The country is tired and sick of it. Let us have peace." What else is there left to do? End of the game. So they said. But our problem here is to understand how Reconstruction, Jonathan, is really now in a process of barely holding on to what it had achieved in a culture, in a political culture, and soon in an economy, greatly changing, it seems, overnight in historical terms. I happen to like it's a Thomas Hovenden painting. It looks very sentimental, I understand that. it can seem a bit romantic. This was done in 1881 by Thomas Hovenden. He's the same Thomas Hovenden who did that famous painting of John Brown. He actually did the John Brown who has the noose around his neck. I showed you a version of it on his way to the gallows kissing the black child. It's a huge painting at the New York Metropolitan. This painting, the Met may have this one too, is it's called Chloe and, what's his name? Chloe and I forgot. Oh, here it is. Chloe and Sam. Now, this was an artist's depiction of two old people in the South in a sharecropper's cabin. They look self-reliant. They're former slaves. They're both very old. Sam is probably making tea and blowing on it. And Chloe's ironing. I don't know what to make. It's stunning. Is that a flag on that table? I'm not sure. Maybe. But here they are, trying to hang on to life, make a life in the circumstances they are left with, on the ground. And I'll come back to this business of tenant farming, sharecropping, and what happened to the bulk, around 80% of all the freed people in the South. That's just the music. Now, real quickly again, I found a better map than that bad one I had the other day. And we can make sure you all get this, students, if you'd like it, although you can find these online too. This shows each of the Confederate states, first date again, when the state was brought back into the Union, and second, when they were redeemed by the Southern Democratic Party, that is, taken back by the white supremacist Southern Democratic Party, sometimes by the uses of terror and violence, as we'll see in a moment, sometimes by other means. Now, quickly though, have a look with me just momentarily at this. There are zillions of these, well, I don't know about zillions, but there are thousands of these ads that were put out by former freedmen all over the country. They sent them to newspapers like the the Christian Recorder, which was the national newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church based in Philadelphia. And this went on for years, even into the early 20th century. Freed people looking for their loved ones. Freed people looking for their uncle, their brother, their mother, their sister, kinfolk. And they'd run these ads. Last time I saw Aunt, Harriet. Last time I saw my brother. If you know him anywhere, here's the address. Check out, these are, I have lots of these. And by the way, there's a brand new book out. Well, it didn't be out yet. I just did a blurb for it. It's not out yet. It's coming out any day. It's called Last Scene. Whoops, I'm supposed to stay here. Sorry, guys. Poor Craig's moving that camera around. Sorry out there. Last Scene, The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families by Judith Giesberg. It's amazing. We'd known about these ads for years and years, and a lot of us, teach with them, quote from them. But nobody had ever done a deep, deep, deep dive into all the newspapers, the religious journals, and all the places that ran these ads. And she's written an entire book about them now. And it's a very moving book. The human urge and desire to find kinfolk that had all been blown apart by the Civil War, blown apart by the process of emancipation, or blown apart by the destruction that went with emancipation. Look at the one lower left, March 29, 1881, if you can read it. Sorry, Craig. Information wanted of my brother. He goes by the name William Henry Butts. We parted at the Battle of Antietam. Also my uncle, by the name of Dick Jackson. We parted at the Battle of Antietam. That probably meant they were in the burial crews. They were probably working there, burying the dead, or serving the army in some form. The others speak for themselves. They're amazing. People give names, name after name after name. Anything that would help locate people. These are all from 1881, but these ads still appear as late as 1900 and 1905. What did freedom mean? A lot of things, but it meant finding family, finding kinfolk. Now, all right, why is Reconstruction, as it's put in place, beginning to fall apart? Well, I want you to look at this with me briefly, just briefly, and we'll come back to it in a moment when I discuss this question of the economic transformations on the ground in the South. This is an illustration of a Georgia plantation, comparing it in 1860 to 1880. This was a quite common thing on the large plantations now, large cotton operations across the cotton belt. The old method of organizing the architecture of the plantation was the slave quarters were all in one place on your left. This probably was a pretty large operation. But within 5 to 10 years, very quickly in some places, because of the system of tenant farming and sharecropping, what happens on the right is what took place. People are now moved to other parts of the land, often with a piece of their own land, and not only their own garden, but a piece of land. It wasn't always 40 acres, and they didn't always get a mule, but they spread out. They began to have something they could call independent. That's my little piece of land. No, that's yours. There's the divider. Now, this looked like an advancement to the freed people. It gave them the chance to get their women out of the fields. That was one big motive, and their children, for that matter. And have their own, they built new cabins. Chloe and Sam had one. It was often one room, maybe 2 rooms. Sharecroppers' cabins still exist in certain areas across the South. Sometimes they call them that, even if they're not. Sometimes they're called slave cabins. Sometimes they actually are. They rebuilt the old slave quarters, but in individual dwellings for families. And the dream here was that you'd have your own little plot of land. You could grow on it. You'd grow foodstuffs and some cotton, and you'd get paid for it. But sharecropping very quickly means you're not going to get paid for it, because and I'll come back to this, it's a terribly cash-poor society. Now, whoops, let's not do the Klan just yet. Now, why does Reconstruction fall apart? Well, there's the question of the waning of radicalism, for sure. Thaddeus Stevens, by the way, an architect of radical Reconstruction, dies at the end of 1868. Some of the other radicals get voted out of office, including John Bingham eventually. But the whole country is going to get hit with a depression in 1873. We know a lot about the connections between economics and elections and politics. Do we ever? I mean, check it out. The Panic of 1873 was the longest lasting depression in American history. In different ways, in different places, it lasted the rest of the 19th century. It was the first great crisis of industrial capitalism in this country that had now created a great deal of industry. and was beginning to build railroads like crazy across the West. Well, had begun. By 1876, 3 years into this, half of the nation's railroads had defaulted on their bonds and were in receivership. Couldn't function. Construction of new track halted. Before the end of 1873, it halted. By 1874, nearly one half the nation's iron forges had suspended operation. This is big-time depression. We just had an election where possibly inflation was the most important issue in an otherwise pretty booming economy. Check this out. The Depression reached bottom in about 1877. We'll come back to 1877 next Thursday, the year of the compromise that sort of settled the election of 1876. Over 10,000 businesses across the country failed, went under. The 65 months after 1873, the spring of 1873, remains the longest period of uninterrupted economic contraction in all of American history. Nothing else has completely matched it. Not the beginning years of the Great Depression and not the financial crisis of 2008. What it brought about to a degree was a kind of a near death in the faith in progress. Progress. And what were the Republicans all about? What was radical Reconstruction all about? Transforming the United States into this great new progressive vision of human equality. Well, they didn't all believe in it on the same level. But what are you going to do with all that vision of progress now when the entire economic bottom is falling out of society? This was the first great clash between capital and labor now in the history of American industrial capitalism, and it nearly blew the country apart. It did blow the country apart. It was a disaster for workers, widespread unemployment. By 1876, 1/4 of New York City was unemployed, 25%. Go to New York, get a job. No, not then. Tramps started. The word tramp came into the American lexicon. They started to appear on roadways and, of course, on railroads, all over the place. Unemployed men. People with signs on them, not in 1933, in 1873, that said, "Work for bread." There, in fact, were work for bread campaigns in cities. Now, this was a country in 1873, 4, 5, and 6 that did not know yet how to manufacture massive social welfare. They had done it to some degree with the Freedmen's Bureau, but the Freedmen's Bureau's last budget was voted in 1870. After that, it was gone. There were attempts by cities and even states to some degree to create public employment. Oh, what an idea. Put some people to work building a road, put some people to work building a school. But in the 19th century, ideologically, intellectually, they weren't yet prepared as the country at least mostly was by the time of the WPA and the New Deal and the TVA, which didn't necessarily entirely save the American economy, but it sure helped. And then came labor strikes and violence. And the most violent labor strike in American history was the 1877 railroad strike across the country. There was this, even before that, in 1875, the so-called long strike in the Pennsylvania anthracite coal fields, shut down coal mining. Class conflict became now a very open subject to Americans. And Americans don't often talk very easily or well about class, but they started to in the 1870s. Now, what was failing? Well, not just the economy, but what was failing was the vision of the Republicans. What did they base their existence on? Well, resistance to slavery and its expansion back in 1854, right? But it was based on this concept, this great concept of free labor. And we've come to call it what they did, free labor ideology. The idea if you could keep labor free and every individual, every man with his wagon, every farmer with his mule, every farm family could get some land and cordon it off and improve it, was becoming his and her own capitalist. And they would experience growth, and their children would have more than they would have. Free labor ideology suddenly looked like it was failing. This idea of free labor as mobility, class mobility, social mobility, failing. And Americans now had to take seriously the idea of dire poverty in a land of plenty. And we've been having to do that ever since, haven't we? How many times do you hear it or do you say it? How can the richest country in the world have this? How can the richest country in the world do that? And of course, what goes with such social unrest is, of course, social order. All right. Well, that's the panic. And the panic's not going to end. Try to have now a national off-year election, 1874. 1 year, 1.5 years into this terrible economic crisis. Good luck. And what happens in that 1874 election is pivotal. I love doing elections. Give me an election conflict and I could talk all day probably. This is going to be a rout of the Republican Party. Think about it. 20 years into their life, that Republican Party and its leadership had run this country through the coming of the Civil War, the breakup of the Union, the all-out Civil War to save the Union and destroy slavery, the rewriting of the Constitution to give it a whole new vision, which was their vision, and all of that rooted in their old economic theory of the harmony of interest. All interest would ultimately be in harmony if you could sustain free labor and all boats would rise together. That comes crashing down on them in the congressional off-year elections of 1874. Again, 20 years into their success. Watch out. Headline in the Buffalo Advertiser on the day after the returns came in, quote, Republican Party struck by lightning. The Democrats captured the United States House in 1874. It went from a Republican majority of 110 to a Democratic majority of 60. I mean, just do the numbers there. That's a huge shift. Part of this is because the Democratic Party has revived. It's revived in the South, and it's really reviving now also in the North. It's reviving as a hard money, white supremacist, anti-Reconstruction, anti-black rights political party, and they got the nation's ear. This election will upset voting patterns and electoral patterns of at least 2 decades old. Now, Republicans were defeated at local levels, towns and cities and states across the country. Democrats managed to win the governor's offices in New York and Massachusetts, where no Dem had done that in quite a while. It was actually the first time since 1858. Of 35 states holding elections, 23 went to the Democrats. It's a sweep. Busted, read another headline. The radical machine gone to smash. That was in a Democratic paper in Louisville. Southerners, by and large, white Southerners, rejoiced over this. They felt redeemed now, even though some of their states still weren't completely back under control. But the glee the Democrats felt was the despair now of Republicans. Why did this happen? Many reasons. The panic has a great deal to do with it. A worn-out political will, if you will, with the issues of Reconstruction. Remember that headline in the New York Tribune in 1870, once the 15th Amendment passes, it's over. And again, the Democrats were brilliant at practicing the politics of wedge issues. They just keep painting the Republican Party as that party of racial equality, amalgamation, miscegenation, and it's their fault we're having this Great Depression. Southern states are increasingly redeemed by the Democratic Party. In that sweep of the 1874 election, Arkansas and Alabama, Florida. Democrats took back the legislature in Florida, not quite yet the governor's office. By the end of this sweep, 7 of the 11 ex-Confederate states were under Democratic rule. Only 4 were left, and soon that will be 3 before there'll be another general election in the country. This is what I mean by 2 revolutions. This counter-revolution seems to come faster than the first one, but it's in every way the politics of reaction. And it's reaction to black freedom. It's reaction to this increase in human equality and a changed social order. But it isn't just all done by votes and ballots. It's also done by violence. The only time in American history when, I think I may have implied this already, that violence became a normal, not every day, but a normal part of national politics. Now, this thing called the Ku Klux Klan deserves a bit of explanation. There's a huge historiography on the Klan, the first Klan, the second Klan. The second Klan came in the 1920s. It was different, but no less deadly. This Klan was formed first in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Its first Grand Dragon was Nathan Bedford Forrest, the famous or infamous cavalry commander in Tennessee for the Confederacy during the war. He was by far not the most important Klan leader during these years. Klan-style terrorism first was used to a significant extent in the 1868 election, again in 1870, again in 1872. I want to come back to their motives and methods in a moment. But because there was so much of it, so much vigilante violence in principally 7 states, the Klan did not really operate much at all in the upper border states. But they really did operate in North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, Texas. Those 7 states, and name Mississippi, such that Ulysses Grant, to his credit, when it came to making war, Grant had a great instinct. Grant moved against the Klan. Now, this was risky business. Grant didn't want to move U.S. federal troops back into a southern state. He just never wanted to do that again. They'd done that. Didn't want to do it, but he did. He got authorization in the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1870, and there were a couple subsequent Klan Acts that buttressed the first one, to use federal troops. And to a great extent, after the Klan, especially in South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina, had done its dastardly deeds in 69, 70 into 71, pretty much blunted and all but wiped out the Klan by 1872. This was a use of state power, use of federal power. This is an old primitive drawing telling Northerners and Yankees what would happen to them if they came south. And what flowed from that effort of the Grant administration was a kind of a last hurrah of the congressional Republicans. They established a huge committee. It has a long title. It's the Committee to Investigate the Problems of Violence in the Late Insurrectionary States, and on the title went. They produced testimony in these 7 states where they appointed tribunals, 3 judges, actually 3 congressmen, always 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, because they still had control. In 71, 72, they held hearings in those 7 states to try to assess what's going on. Who's committing this violence? What kind of violence? Are the rumors true? And they had several thousand witnesses, black and white. Former high-ranking Confederate officers like John B. Gordon in Georgia, who was a founder of the Klan in the state of Georgia, who came in and lied through his teeth about what the Klan was doing, hardly alone. But from that testimony, they produced 14 volumes of testimony, which is all digitized today. I used those volumes in hard copy, good old-fashioned hard copy, when I was writing my book, Race and Reunion. It's one of the most amazing sources in American history of raw, on-the-ground testimony by human beings who had been victims of Klan violence. A lot of the violence was intimidation, torture, burning of houses, burning of schools, burning of businesses, and often killings, sometimes mass killings. Not always by hooded men on horseback, but sometimes. And the aims of these Klan groups and their imitators, though sometimes economic, were really political. Their principal goal was to stop Republican politics, whether it's with black people voting or white Republicans voting. Their goal was to wipe the Republican Party out of Georgia, wipe the Republican Party out of Mississippi. And in parts of the South, they succeeded. Now, pray we will never reach that point again with domestic terrorist violence. But the numbers are incredible. In Louisiana, in this period from about 69 to 75, approximately 1,000 people, mostly black, were killed in vigilante terrorist violence. Arkansas had over 200 political assassinations of Republicans, black and white. 1 out of every 10 delegates to Republican conventions or even state conventions to write the new constitutions in 68 or 69 were killed. And the numbers, I could go on and on and on. Eric Foner's book has several good examples. He treats, for example, the Meriden, Mississippi massacre of 1871 with some detail. Now, these Klan acts passed by the remaining Republican Congress before they were thrown out in 74 were remarkable acts because it federalized remember back to John Bingham and the federalizing of the Bill of Rights? It federalized state power, federal power, to go into the South and stop a, quote, state of insurrection and to try to prevent it from happening again. Now, I'll spare you the rest of the toll of how many deaths and how many, the state of Kentucky, for example. Somebody did an estimate that there were approximately 400 lynchings in the state of Kentucky in the Reconstruction years. As the old saying goes, Kentucky never really left the Union and joined the Confederacy during the war. They joined it after the war. There were prosecutions that came out of those famous Klan hearings, testimony. Lots of prosecutions. That was the point of the hearings. Could you develop evidence that would stand up in court and you could try these people? Well, thousands were arrested. 3,310 people were indicted. Many pled guilty to get suspended sentences, because in their communities what they had done was just okay, fine. 1,143 were convicted. 250 were acquitted. These trials went on for a few years. Most who were convicted received fines or light jail sentences. 65 total were imprisoned for up to 5 years at a federal prison in Albany, New York. All of them were out, either by parole or otherwise, by the election of 1876. Thousands of people have been murdered, tortured, humiliated, mutilated by Klan violence. America did not seriously adjudicate those crimes. It's one of Reconstruction's ugliest legacies, and it's all over black art. Whether it's novels or poetry or other forms. All right, I'm going to come back to sharecropping and Chloe and Sam a little bit more on Thursday, but I want to leave you with this. My mic still on? Yes, of course. James Weldon Johnson, the great novelist, poet, essayist, leader of the NAACP, and the subject of my next biography, he wrote this magical little novel in 1912 without putting his name on it. Second edition had his name on it. It's called The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. The protagonist is passing for white. He's black, but he can pass in most circumstances. And so he has a certain vision in the book, a certain ear on conversations. It's an incredible little book. The first modern African-American novel. There's so many modernist aspects to it, whatever you think modernism is. There's an incredible scene toward the end of the book. He's riding a train into the South, and there are 4 or 5 different kinds of characters. There's a young Yankee school teacher going south, full of idealism, to be a teacher. There's an old Yankee soldier, some old veteran who's kind of lost his will and doesn't think this Reconstruction thing makes any sense anymore, never did in his view. There's an old white planter, cotton planter, doing very well, and preaches at everybody, tells them what a terrible thing that Reconstruction was. And then there's a northern businessman who's going south to invest. He's going to invest all kinds of things. They're all having a conversation. And an ex-colored man just overhears it. They don't invite him in. He just overhears it. And what Johnson does in that scene is a brilliant illustration of what had happened by somewhere in the late 19th century, whatever the date is he's placing this, and you're not told, what's happened to the memory of emancipation in that war. But then it ends. They get to a destination in the Deep South, and the city or town that Johnson, or the ex-colored man is in, is having a lynching. There's a big mob and a big crowd. And this is how Johnson ends it. He just happens into this town. He happens upon a lynching. And he's watching it. A railroad tie was sunk into the ground, the rope was removed, and a chain brought and securely coiled around the victim and the stake. There he stood, a man only in form and stature. His eyes were full and vacant, indicating not a single ray of thought. Fuel was brought from everywhere. Oil, the torch, the flames crouched for an instant as though to gather strength, then leaped up as high as their victim's head. He squirmed, he writhed, strained at his chains, then gave out cries and groans that I shall always hear. His eyes, bulging from their sockets, rolled from side to side, appealing in vain for help. I was fixed to the spot where I stood, powerless to take my eyes from what I did not want to see. What Johnson has captured there, as any great writer, as great writers can, is this notion of what we may always hear, but we don't want to see. That's kind of what we do with history sometimes. We don't want to see it. We might hear it, echoes of it, just hints of it, but we don't want to have to see it. Thank you.